Dorian, I can't eat while that smell is sitting right next to me. My future daughter-in-law, Saskia Sterling, set her wine glass down on the white marble table. She did not do it gently. The sharp, icy sound of crystal striking stone rang out like a physical blow, cutting through the warm, candlelit atmosphere of the dining room. I froze in the middle of the room, my arms still wrapped tightly around a small, beautifully carved wooden box. The box was made from fragrant cedar wood, its lid hand-carved with delicate patterns of rolling waves. A final sacred gift from my late wife, Genevieve, meant especially for our son Dorian, on the day he got married. A sudden violent rainstorm had just passed outside, leaving the coastal air of Kennebunkport, Maine, thick with dampness. In my hurry to get to the housewarming dinner, I had thrown on my old wool work jacket, and my leather work boots were still stained with a little dried mud from the shipyard. The jacket, which I had worn for decades in my workshop, still carried the sharp, earthy scent of pine shavings, sea salt, and traditional wood varnish. I looked at Saskia, but she refused to meet my eyes. Instead, her dark red polished fingers lifted a silk napkin, delicately covering her nose as she leaned back in her chair with a look of theatrical disgust. "I'm sorry, Saskia," I said, keeping my voice low and steady, speaking with the calm, quiet patience of an old craftsman who had spent 40 years working with his hands. A neighbor's historical wooden dory was taking on water down at the salt marsh during the high tide. I rushed over to help him pull it to safety before the hull was smashed against the rocks. I went home, showered thoroughly, washed my hair twice, and changed into my cleanest clothes. But I guess the scent of pine tar and marsh mud is still clinging to the wool of this old jacket. Saskia curled her lip, her cold green eyes sweeping over my worn boots before stopping on my weathered, lined face. The sheer, unadulterated contempt in her expression was impossible to hide. "You don't just smell like pine tar, Ignatius," she sneered, her voice dripping with condescension. "You smell like a rotting salt marsh. You smell like a decaying dock. This is our expensive new Harborview townhouse. It is not your filthy, cluttered boatyard." She turned her head toward Dorian, who sat at the head of the table. Her voice dropped, shifting into a sharp, commanding tone. "Dorian, can you please tell your father to go sit out on the porch? I can't breathe with him sitting right next to me." I turned to look at my son. Dorian was sitting perfectly still, his face going completely blank under the warm glow of the chandelier. He did not say anything right away, his hands resting flat on the table. Saskia took his silence as absolute agreement. She curled her lips into a satisfied, triumphant smile, looking around the table at her parents and friends before adding one more sentence. "And from now on, I don't want him showing up here looking filthy like this whenever he feels like it. We have neighbors to think about." Dorian quietly let out a long, slow breath. He did not raise his voice. He did not slam his hand on the marble table. He slowly stood up from his chair, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the room. He walked past Saskia, his face an unreadable mask, and stepped toward the kitchen counter. His hand reached out and picked up the heavy brass key fob to the new townhouse, the very keys that had been handed to Saskia only that afternoon. Dorian walked slowly back to the dining table, stopping directly in front of his fiancée. He held out his hand, palm flat. "Give me the house keys," Dorian said, his voice low, flat, but carrying a sudden crushing weight like a stone dropping into a deep well. Saskia burst out laughing, a high-pitched, mocking sound that echoed off the high ceilings. She tilted her head, looking up at him as though he had just told the most ridiculous joke. "What did you just say, Dorian?" Dorian looked straight into her eyes, his gaze cold, steady, and completely unyielding. "I said, give me the house keys." At that exact moment, Saskia still did not understand that what my son was taking back was not just a set of brass keys. He was taking back the entire future she believed already belonged to her. What would you do if the person about to become part of your family publicly humiliated your father inside the very house he had paid for himself? Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab himself a warm cup of coffee, a few snacks, get comfortable, and remember this. The people in these stories had every single opportunity to do the right thing. They simply chose not to. Leave a number 1 in the comments so we can begin the story, and hit the like button, because I believe you're going to enjoy this one. The dining room, glowing beneath the luxury crystal lights, fell into a chilling, suffocating silence. Saskia remained seated, her chin slightly raised, her fingers still clutching her silk napkin. She truly believed Dorian was simply nursing a bruised masculine ego, throwing a temporary temper tantrum. She had absolutely no idea what this corner of the harbor, these white townhouse walls, and even that set of brass keys had cost our family. It had all begun 6 months earlier. I lived alone in the modest wooden cottage beside my boatyard, where I restored antique wooden hulls. My late wife, Genevieve, had passed away from a sudden, aggressive illness 8 years earlier. She had left behind an empty space in my heart that no amount of work could ever fill. On the western side of the boatyard was a small, secluded cove. Genevieve had loved that cove. She had spent her first spring after we married planting 12 wild beach rose bushes there with her own hands. Every time I stood looking at those roses blooming against the gray Atlantic waves, I could still see her face, her laughter carrying on the salty breeze. Genevieve had always told me that the Western Cove was meant for Dorian's future. A beautiful place where he could build a life when the time came. When Dorian told me he wanted to marry Saskia, I was genuinely happy for him. He was a brilliant young naval architect, but like many young professionals starting out in the city, he and Saskia were struggling to come up with the massive down payment required for a home in this historic upscale coastal neighborhood. I decided to sell the Western Cove. I signed the real estate sales contract with the very same trembling hand that had held Genevieve's during the final, quiet hours of her life in the hospital. The real estate broker told me I had gotten an excellent price, $135,000, but there was no amount of money that could make me feel like I had won. I had just sold the most precious living memory of my late wife. But all I knew was that my son needed a home to start his family, and I knew Genevieve would have wanted to help him build his future. I gave Dorian $90,000 in cash for the down payment, keeping the rest to pay the boatyard's rising property taxes and repair the leaking cedar roof of my workshop. Dorian had strongly objected at first. He wept, telling me he did not want me to sacrifice his mother's beloved beach rose garden for his comfort. I took his hand and told him, "The ocean will always be there, Dorian. But your youth won't wait. Go build a good, loving family in your new home." The day I handed them the cash for the down payment, Saskia threw her arms around my neck. She wept tears of joy, her voice soft and sweet as she called me by the name that warmed my lonely heart, Dad. She looked into my eyes and told me I was the most generous, wonderful father anyone could ever ask for. But while she was hugging me, her face pressed against my shoulder, Saskia whispered a quiet, casual question in my ear. "Dad, how many acres does the boatyard still have altogether, including the waterfront?" At the time, I simply smiled, thinking it was nothing more than the innocent, curious interest of a future daughter-in-law, wanting to learn about her husband's family heritage. Like a fool, I proudly told her about the size of the boatyard and the historical value of our waterfront property. I was far too naive. Looking back now, I finally understand that on that day, Saskia did not hug me because she was grateful. She was calculating how much property I still had left to sell after the first piece of land that had belonged to my late wife. Saskia's deep-seated greed did not appear overnight. It grew slowly and systematically, hiding behind fake, polite smiles, artificial charm, and a manufactured elegance that I was, unfortunately, far too blind to see. I still remember the first time the three of us ate dinner at an incredibly expensive, high-end French restaurant in the heart of downtown Portland, called the Meridian. The dining room was filled with soft candlelight, grand chandeliers, and wealthy patrons speaking in quiet, hushed tones. I felt completely out of place in my simple, off-the-rack civilian suit, my rough hands resting awkwardly on the pristine white linen tablecloth. When the waiter handed us the menus, which were written entirely in French, my eyes blurred. I tried my best to navigate the foreign words, and when it came my turn to order, I mispronounced the name of one of the delicate seafood dishes, stumbling over the French vowels with my gravelly working-class Maine voice. Saskia immediately let out a loud mocking giggle, covering her mouth with her manicured hand. She did not do it quietly. She corrected me right in front of the waiter, her voice projected just loud enough for the surrounding tables of wealthy diners to hear. "Oh, Ignatius, please," she laughed, her eyes glittering with a condescending amusement. "Dad has spent far too many decades in his dusty, cluttered boatyard surrounded by sea salt and grease. He's simply not used to refined, civilized places like this. He thinks French cuisine is the same as a lobster boil down at the docks. Just let me order for you, Dad, so we don't completely confuse the kitchen staff and embarrass us." Dorian's face went pale, his jaw tightening so hard that the muscles along his temples bulged. He stared at his fiancée, his hands clenching his silverware. He was about to speak up, to defend his father's honor, but I quickly reached across the table and patted his arm, waving him off with a gentle smile. I forced a quiet laugh to smooth over the rising tension, telling my son it was perfectly fine. I told myself she was just young, vivacious, and accustomed to high society ways where appearances were everything. I swallowed the small bite of humiliation, choosing to believe in her goodness. The second warning came right outside their brand new Harborview townhouse. One warm summer afternoon, I drove my old, salt-rusted Ford F-150 pickup truck over to deliver some fresh ocean-caught lobsters and sea-salted vegetables I had harvested from my coastal garden. The old truck had a dented tailgate and a squeaky belt, a vehicle that had served me faithfully for 15 years. As I pulled into the paved driveway, the loud engine rumbled against the pristine walls of the neighboring properties. Saskia was standing on the front porch, dressed in an elegant silk dress, holding a glass of iced tea. She did not step down to welcome me or help me carry the heavy bags of fresh seafood. Instead, she stood at the top of the stone stairs, looking at my truck with obvious physical disgust, her face twisted as if she were looking at a pile of burning garbage. She walked down the steps quickly, looking around the street frantically to see if any of the neighbors were watching. She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly tight, and lowered her voice to a harsh, cutting whisper. "Dad, what are you doing?" she hissed, her eyes darting back and forth. "Could you please park your truck on the back street instead of our driveway? This is a highly exclusive, upscale neighborhood. The HOA is incredibly strict here. If our neighbors see that rusty, loud eyesore parked in our driveway, they'll judge us. They'll think we come from some trashy, low-class background. It completely ruins the image we are trying to build here." I stood there in the warm Maine sunshine, holding the heavy bags of fresh lobster, feeling a cold wave of bitterness wash over me. But I said nothing. I did not want to cause a fight between her and Dorian. Without saying a single word to argue, I quietly climbed back into my cab, started the loud engine, drove around to the narrow, dusty alley behind the townhouse, and carried the heavy bags of seafood through their service entrance. I told myself it was just the generation gap, that young people in the city were under immense social pressure. The third warning came while they were planning the details of the wedding ceremony. Saskia insisted that I rent a brand new designer tuxedo from a high-end boutique in Boston. She did not want me wearing the vintage navy wool suit that Genevieve had carefully saved up her household money to buy for me 12 years earlier. It was the suit I had worn to Dorian's high school graduation, the suit Genevieve had pressed with her own hands before she passed away. It held a piece of her soul. When I showed the suit to Saskia, hoping she would understand its sentimental value, she curled her lip and waved her hand dismissively. "That old suit looks so provincial and shabby, Ignatius," she sneered, her voice cold and entirely devoid of empathy. "The fabric looks so heavy and cheap. Our wedding photos are going to last forever, and we are going to display them in our living room when our high society friends come over. I don't want our future children looking at those photos and seeing an old, dusty dockworker. It ruins the entire elegant aesthetic we've worked so hard to design. You'll just have to rent the designer tux." Once again, I simply nodded. I accepted the deep, quiet hurt inside my chest, locking it away in the dark corners of my mind, just so my son could have a perfect, conflict-free wedding day. I called it modern taste. I told myself it was the stress of planning a large wedding. I gave her behavior every single excuse in the world, refusing to see the raw, ugly truth staring me in the face. It was not stress, it was absolute, classist contempt for the man whose sacrifices had paid for her comfort. More than once, Dorian asked me in private whether Saskia was treating me with disrespect. He looked into my tired, weathered eyes, asking if her words were hurting me, begging me to tell him the truth. And what did I do? I stubbornly defended her. I told my son not to ruin his relationship over a few thoughtless, stressed words. I urged him to be patient with Saskia, telling him that her heart was good under her expensive exterior. That was the absolute greatest mistake of my life. My cowardly, patient silence had only encouraged her to push even further, believing that she could trample on my dignity and my late wife's memory without ever facing a single consequence. About 2 months before that fateful housewarming dinner, Saskia began asking strange, probing questions during our brief family gatherings. She became increasingly focused on my family's financial assets and the total market value of our coastal boatyard. How many acres of prime waterfront did we still own? Had I written my formal will yet? When I got too old to work, would I sell the rest of the land to pay for a luxury retirement home? Or was I planning to move in with the two of them in their new townhouse? Dorian started paying very close attention to her questions. He knew his father. He knew I was a simple man, who wanted nothing more than to work in my shop until my hands could no longer hold a chisel. He realized her sudden curiosity did not come from a place of loving concern for an aging parent. They came from a cold, calculating greed that was quietly mapping out our family's assets. The terrifying truth exploded one late evening. Saskia was in the master bedroom of their rented apartment, talking on the phone with her best friend, Giselle. Dorian had just come home early from his design firm, and he was standing in the dark hallway, holding a glass of water, preparing to walk in and surprise her. Saskia's sharp, clear voice drifted through the narrow crack beneath the closed door, cold, calculated, and utterly merciless. "Let's just get married first, Giselle," Saskia whispered, her tone carrying a light, scheming chuckle that made Dorian's blood run cold. "Once the wedding is official and my name is on the paperwork, I'll make Dorian convince the old man to sell the rest of that coastal boatyard. What's a lonely old widower going to do with all that prime shorefront anyway? The land alone is worth at least $2.5 million. I've already talked to a developer who wants to turn the shipyard into a private luxury yacht club. I only have to put up with the old man and his dusty shipyard stories for a few more months. It's a small price to pay for a multi-million-dollar waterfront payout." Dorian stood frozen in the dark hallway, his hand trembling so violently that the water rippled and splashed against the sides of his glass. The woman he loved, the woman he was about to marry, was discussing his father's death and the destruction of his family's heritage like they were simple business transactions. He did not burst into the bedroom to confront her. He knew that if he did, she would simply lie, cry, and manipulate her way out of it. He needed a clear head, a cold heart, and absolute proof. A few days later, Saskia showed Dorian a newly redesigned, luxury interior blueprint for their new townhouse. She had personally hired an expensive designer to alter the layout. She had completely eliminated the small guest bedroom on the second floor. The room Dorian had specifically designed for me so I could have a place to stay when my joints ached in the winter. In its place, she had added an extravagant walk-in closet for her designer shoes and a private, heated grooming studio for her purebred Persian cat. When Dorian asked her about it directly, pointing to the altered blueprint, Saskia answered without the slightest hesitation or guilt. "Your dad already has that huge, drafty boatyard, Dorian," she said, rolling her eyes. "He doesn't need to stay here. Besides, his smell of pine tar, wood resin, and salt mud will soak into our expensive velvet chairs and customized curtains. We can't have our luxury home smelling like a common harbor dock when we host dinner parties. It's just not practical." Dorian looked at the woman he had once wanted to spend the rest of his life with, and he felt a cold, deep chasm open up between them. He realized that Saskia did not just hate the rustic smell of a traditional shipyard. She hated his family. She hated the humble, honest father who had worked 60 hours a week in the freezing winter wind to put Dorian through an elite naval engineering school. She viewed his family as nothing more than a financial stepping stone to be used and discarded. Without telling anyone, Dorian quietly met with our family's corporate attorney. Because they were not yet legally married, the purchase contract and the deed for the new townhouse were entirely in Dorian's name alone. The $90,000 down payment had come directly from me, from selling his mother's beloved Beach Rose Cove. During his investigation, Dorian also discovered that Saskia had been bragging to her high society friends everywhere she went. She had been sending group messages and posting on private social media accounts, proudly claiming that the $600,000 harbor townhouse was a personal wedding gift to her from her wealthy, prestigious future in-laws, painting herself as a glamorous heiress marrying into wealth. Dorian kept all of this painful knowledge completely to himself, protecting me from the devastating truth while he quietly finalized his plans. He was going to give her one final, defining test to see if she had any humanity left. That afternoon, a major emergency broke out down at the salt marsh. A sudden, violent nor'easter squall had rolled in off the freezing Atlantic, bringing 50-mile-an-hour winds and lashing, ice-cold rain. One of my oldest friends, an 80-year-old retired lobsterman named Arthur, had his historic wooden dory slip its moorings down at the harbor. The beautiful hand-built vessel, a craft that Arthur had spent his entire life maintaining, was taking on water rapidly, its fragile pine hull pounding violently against the sharp, jagged granite rocks of the coastal wall. I could not abandon a piece of maritime history, nor could I abandon my friend in his moment of panic. I fought the freezing wind, the blinding rain, and the thick black mud of the salt marsh for 3 grueling, exhausting hours. Working up to my knees in freezing salt water, my hands numb and aching, I managed to wedge a heavy iron lever under the hull and pull the boat up onto the muddy shore, securing the thick hemp lines to the sturdy oak trees. By the time we got the dory safe, my muscles were trembling with exhaustion, and my boots were caked in thick, dark salt mud. I hurried back to my cottage, knowing I was already running late for the housewarming dinner. I showered thoroughly, scrubbed my skin until it was raw, washed my hair twice with industrial-strength soap to get rid of the smell of salt mud, and changed into the cleanest pressed clothes I owned. I threw on my heavy wool work jacket and ran out the door. On the passenger seat of my truck sat the small polished cedarwood box. Inside were the most precious heirlooms our family possessed. A delicate hand-woven lace tablecloth Genevieve had made from scrap thread during her quiet evenings by the fire. A beautiful handwritten letter she had penned for Dorian on the day of his wedding during her final days in her hospital bed. And a bottle of rich blackberry cordial I had brewed myself from the very last harvest of wild berries from the Western Cove before I sold it. They were not expensive, flashy gifts from a designer boutique, but they held the blood, sweat, tears, and absolute love of a mother who was gone. I arrived 30 minutes late. As I walked up the paved driveway, the warm, luxury interior of the townhouse was filled with loud laughter, classical music, and the clinking of wine glasses. All the guests had already arrived. Saskia's wealthy parents, Alistair and Eleanor Sterling, her sister, and her two elegant best friends from the city. Everyone was dressed in expensive, high-fashion clothes that smelled of heavy designer perfume. Saskia opened the door. She did not look at my face or ask if I had made it safely through the storm. Her eyes went straight down to my leather boots, which were still slightly marked with a small trace of dried salt mud around the soles. She frowned, her face contorting into a look of absolute physical disgust. "Did you come straight here from a rotting shipyard, Ignatius?" she asked, her voice loud enough to cut through the classical music and silence the chatter in the living room. "You look completely disheveled." I forced a warm, friendly smile, trying to keep the peace for my son's sake. "Almost, sweetheart. But I showered and cleaned up thoroughly. My friend's historic boat is safe and secure." Not a single person in the living room smiled. Not one person asked about the boat, the storm, or my friend's safety. They stared at me as if I were a wild animal that had wandered into a pristine museum. Instead of welcoming me inside, Saskia threw the front door wide open, as though she were trying to air out a toxic gas. She pointed her finger sharply toward the freezing dark garage. "Ignatius, take your boots off in the garage," she commanded coldly, her voice sharp as glass. "Do not bring that filthy mud and smell onto our new expensive hardwood floors. It's brand new." I quietly did exactly as she asked, stepping out into the cold garage, unlacing my boots with trembling fingers, and walking back into the house in my socks. The moment I stepped across the threshold, I heard the sharp, rhythmic hiss of an aerosol air freshener behind me. Saskia was following close behind my heels, spraying the lavender-scented chemical air everywhere I had just walked, her face twisted in a look of complete sneering triumph. The guests in the living room watched her, whispering and chuckling behind their wine glasses. I swallowed the painful lump of humiliation in my throat, telling myself that for my son's sake, I would endure any level of cruelty. We sat down at the lavish dining table. Saskia's father, Alistair, took a slow, theatrical sip of his expensive wine, clicked his tongue, and looked at me with a patronizing smirk. "I guess shipwrights and dockworkers just get used to the smell of rotting wharf, dead seaweed, and fish scales, don't they, Ignatius? It must be hard to get that smell off." Saskia chimed in immediately, her voice sharp and dripping with malice. "The problem is, Alistair, the civilized people around them don't. It's absolutely suffocating." Dorian heard every single word. His hand froze around his silver knife and fork, his knuckles turning stark white as he set them down slowly on the porcelain plate. The sharp, resonant clack echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. But he still held himself back, his eyes dark as a stormy sea. He wanted to see just how far Saskia was willing to go, to let her reveal her entire black heart before he struck. I pulled out my wooden chair, intending to sit down in the empty seat beside Saskia. I thought the worst I would have to endure was another tasteless, elitist joke. But the moment my chair slid back against the floor, Saskia suddenly sprang to her feet, taking 2 rapid steps backward as if I had just dumped a bucket of rotting fish onto the marble table. She folded her arms tightly across her chest, her eyes blazing with an artificial, dramatic fury. "Dorian, I can't eat while that smell is sitting right next to me," she screamed, her voice cutting through the room like ice. "He smells like a rotting salt marsh." An absolute, suffocating silence swallowed the entire room. Saskia's mother, Eleanor, immediately lowered her eyes to her plate, suddenly fascinated by her food, while her father, Alistair, turned his head toward the window, refusing to intervene. My throat felt incredibly dry and bitter. I stood there, clutching the cedarwood box tightly in my hands, my chest aching. I forced a quiet, peaceful smile onto my face, preparing to slip away. "It's all right, everyone," I said softly, my voice trembling slightly. "I'm sorry to have ruined your dinner. I'll move to another seat, or I can just go home." But before I could take a step, Dorian reached out. His strong, calloused hand rested firmly on my shoulder, gently but with absolute authority pressing me back down into my chair. He did not look at me. He kept his eyes locked onto Saskia, his gaze as cold and dark as a winter storm over the Atlantic. Seeing that Dorian was defending me, Saskia raised her voice even higher, her face flushing red as she abandoned any remaining shred of polite high society pretense. Dorian, I have tried to be polite and patient so many times, she screamed, gesturing wildly around the beautiful room. This is an upscale, exclusive neighborhood. If our neighbors see your dad's rusted old pickup truck parked outside, his muddy boots, and him looking like a common dock worker, what on earth are they going to think? I don't want people thinking we are that kind of family. It's embarrassing. Dorian spoke through clenched teeth, his voice dangerously low. What kind of family, Saskia? The kind of family that doesn't know how to behave in polite society, she shrieked, pointing her finger directly at my face. The kind of family that brings the smell of pine tar and marsh mud into a $600,000 townhouse. You can go back to your dirty boatyard, Ignatius, clean yourself up properly, and come back some other time when you look appropriate. You are ruining our special night. It was only then that Saskia's mother, Eleanor, finally spoke. But she did not speak to correct or stop her daughter's cruel behavior. Instead, she took a delicate sip of her wine, adjusted her gold necklace, and calmly added, "Well, Dorian, maybe every family should have its own boundaries. We have to maintain our standards if we want to fit in here. Ignatius's appearance is rather rustic for a housewarming dinner." My dignity had been completely trampled in front of a room full of strangers. I stood up again, picking up Genevieve's cedarwood box. I could feel the tears stinging the back of my eyes, but I forced myself to stay strong. "It's all right, Dorian, I'm going home. Let's not ruin your evening." But Dorian shot to his feet, his tall frame towering over the table. He looked at Saskia, then he looked straight into my eyes, his face a mask of absolute icy determination. "No, Dad, you are not the one who needs to leave." Dorian walked slowly toward the kitchen counter, picked up the brass key fob, and held it out in front of Saskia. "Give me the house keys." Saskia curled her lip into a faint, mocking smile. She still believed Dorian was simply overreacting to protect his father's feelings, throwing a small tantrum that would blow over by morning. "Oh, Dorian, don't make such a ridiculous, dramatic scene over one little comment. I was just stressed. Everyone knows I didn't mean it literally." "It isn't one comment, Saskia," Dorian said, his voice quiet but echoing through the silent room like thunder. "It is every single comment before this that I pretended not to hear just to keep the peace. It is the way you laughed at my father at the restaurant. It is the way you made him park in the back alley. It is the way you tried to throw away my mother's vintage suit. Give me the keys." Saskia let out a cold, irritated snort. She reached into her designer purse, pulled out the set of spare keys, and threw them onto the white marble table with a loud, clattering thud. She still believed Dorian would call her the next morning, begging for her forgiveness and apologizing for his dramatic behavior. But then Dorian took his phone out of his pocket and tapped the screen. He began to read a series of text messages aloud. The moment the first words left his mouth, the color instantly drained from Saskia's face, leaving her as pale as a ghost. "I only have to put up with the old man until after the wedding," Dorian read, his voice calm, deliberate, and devastatingly clear. "That waterfront boatyard is worth at least $2.5 million. Once we are legally married, Dorian will have to choose between his wife and that old man's dusty workshop. We'll sell the yard and buy a mansion." Dorian swiped the screen, reading another message. "The townhouse is only the beginning, Giselle. I have absolutely no intention of spending the rest of my life surrounded by the smell of pine tar and those cheap coastal dinners. We'll get the boatyard sold within a year." Saskia lunged forward, her fingers clawing at the air as she tried to snatch the phone from his hand. Dorian stepped back effortlessly, raising the device out of her reach. "You invaded my privacy," Saskia screamed, her voice cracking with pure panic and anger. "You were spying on my phone. You're a sick, paranoid freak. My parents will sue you." Dorian looked down at her with a cold, unshakable contempt. "The tablet you gave me to use for booking our wedding catering was synced to your iCloud account, Saskia. Every single message you sent popped up automatically on my screen. I wasn't spying on you. You were simply too stupid and careless to realize your own greed was broadcasting itself to my devices. Get your facts straight!" Saskia frantically looked toward her parents, but Alistair and Eleanor were staring at the floor, their faces pale with shock and embarrassment. She turned back to Dorian, her tone shifting instantly into a frantic, desperate plead. "Dorian, please, I was just joking with Giselle. You know how stressed I've been with the wedding planning. The anxiety made me say stupid, dramatic things. You're being way too sensitive. It was just girl talk." When she saw that Dorian remained completely silent, her desperation turned back into anger, and she pointed her finger at me. "This is all your dad's fault. If he hadn't kept interfering in our lives, if he hadn't shown up at our housewarming dinner looking like a filthy dock worker, I never would have said those things. I stood there by the table, completely motionless. I did not raise my voice, I did not argue. I looked straight into the tear-streaked eyes of the young woman who had once hugged me so warmly and called me, "Dad, did you ever love Dorian, Saskia?" I asked, my voice very quiet. "Or did you only love the wealthy life you thought my wife's memory could buy for you?" Saskia shouted, her voice shrill with rage. "You have no right to question me in my own house." Dorian stepped forward, positioning himself directly between Saskia and me. He looked at her with the coldest form of judgment I have ever seen on a human face. "That is exactly the problem, Saskia. You thought everything in this room already belonged to you before you ever learned to respect the person who made it possible." Dorian emphasized every single syllable, his voice ringing through the house. "The $90,000 down payment for this townhouse came from my father selling the Beach Rose Cove that belonged to my late mother. The deed and the mortgage to this house are in my name alone. We are not legally married. You do not own a single square inch of this property." Dorian turned his cold gaze toward Saskia's stunned parents. "The wedding is cancelled. This townhouse will be put on the market tomorrow morning. Get your things and get out of my sight." Saskia stood completely frozen, her eyes wide with absolute paralyzed shock. You're throwing away 3 whole years of our relationship just because your dad's feelings got hurt? How can you be so heartless and cruel, Dorian? We've built a life together." Dorian looked straight into her tear-streaked face, his expression never softening for a single second, his voice as flat and heavy as granite. "No, Saskia. I am ending these past 3 years because you just proved something to me. You would make me choose between my wife and my father for the rest of my life. You would trample on the memory of the mother who gave me life, and the father who built my future. And I will never, under any circumstances, choose a parasitic, greedy monster over my family." At that point, Saskia's parents could no longer remain silent. Alistair stood up slowly, adjusting his expensive designer suit jacket, his voice carrying a mixture of a heavy threat and a desperate rising plea. "Dorian, you need to think this through very carefully. Calling off the wedding now will publicly humiliate my daughter in front of all her high society friends, her colleagues, and our business partners. Our family cannot bear that kind of public shame. It will ruin our reputation in Portland." Dorian turned his sharp, icy gaze toward Alistair, his eyes like daggers cutting through the older man's pretension. "Then what about your daughter publicly humiliating my father in front of everyone at this table? What about her mocking his life's work? Is my father's dignity and my mother's memory worth less than your precious family reputation? Answer me that, Alistair." Alistair opened his mouth, but no words came out. Eleanor quickly grabbed Saskia's trembling arm, her voice frantic and high-pitched. "Saskia, apologize to him. Hurry before this gets completely out of hand." Saskia bit her lip so hard it began to bleed, the red droplet stark against her pale skin. She turned toward me, tears smearing her expensive mascara, her voice forced, hollow, and bitter. "I'm sorry if you felt offended, Ignatius." I looked at the young woman standing before me, and I slowly shook my head. My voice was calm, but entirely unwavering, carrying the dignity of a lifetime of honest labor. "That is not a real apology, Saskia. You are not apologizing for the cruel, arrogant things you did to an old craftsman in his socks. You are only apologizing because I wasn't quiet and submissive enough to let you escape the consequences of your own greed. You are apologizing because you got caught." Saskia froze, realizing she could no longer manipulate the old man she had tried to bully. She quickly dropped to her knees on the hardwood floor beside Dorian, grabbing the hem of his jacket with frantic fingers. "Dorian, I promise I'll change. I'll never act like that again. I'll let your dad stay here whenever he wants. Please, don't do this to us. I love you." Dorian reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a stack of crisp white documents. He placed them firmly on the marble table, right on top of her glass keys. "These are official papers from my attorney. This is the formal notice canceling our wedding contract, and this is the order to seal this townhouse for immediate resale. We are finished, Saskia. There is nothing left to negotiate." Saskia screamed, her voice cracking with pure despair and fury. "You've lost your mind. You can't sell this house. We picked out every single paint color, every luxury curtain, and every piece of furniture together. It's mine." Dorian brushed her hand off his jacket, stepping back beside me and wrapping his arm around my shoulders. "My father paid for this townhouse with the piece of land my late mother treasured most. I will never build a future with someone who looks down on the two people who gave me life. Now, pack your bags and get out." Dorian did not yell, he did not throw things. He did not lower himself to insults or crude language. He simply took back everything Saskia had believed already belonged to her. The house keys, the engagement ring, the wedding plans, and the privilege of ever becoming part of our family. Saskia's parents pulled her to her feet, and in absolute, crushing humiliation, they left the townhouse, their heels clicking hollowly down the hallway. Only my son and I remained in the silent, beautiful townhouse. I gently patted Dorian on his shoulder, and the two of us embraced. The quiet room filled only with our shared breathing and the distant sound of the rain lashing against the glass. I thought everything had ended there. But the next morning, as the sun began to rise over the foggy Kennebunkport Bay, the doorbell at my boatyard cottage began to ring. The coastal fog was thick, smelling of salt water and damp cedar shavings. I walked outside, pulling my heavy wool jacket tight against the morning chill. Saskia was standing by my weathered wooden gate. She was dressed far more simply than she had been the night before, wearing a plain sweatshirt, her hair messy, her eyes swollen and red from crying all night. She had come completely alone. "Dad," she whispered, her voice filled with desperate tears as she reached across the wooden gate. "Please, please convince Dorian to come back to me. I truly love him. I can't live without him. I'll do anything." I leaned against the weathered wooden fence and looked at her quietly, feeling a profound sense of sadness. "Did you come here because you truly love him, Saskia? Or did you come here because you are terrified of losing the wealthy, comfortable future you thought was about to become yours? Did you come here because the high society mansion you planned to buy is slipping away?" Saskia froze, the forced, pleading smile on her lips disappearing instantly as she realized I was not going to soften. Her true, manipulative nature quickly resurfaced, her eyes narrowing as she stepped closer, lowering her voice into a sharp, transactional whisper. "Just think about it, Ignatius," she whispered, trying to persuade me. "If the townhouse is sold now, we'll lose a fortune in realtor fees, contract penalties, and wedding deposits. It's a waste of your money. If you just turn that $90,000 down payment into a joint wedding gift and put my name on the property title, Dorian will see that you support our marriage. He'll come back to me. It's the only logical choice for your family's finances." I looked at the young woman standing before me with a profound, deep sadness. "You came here asking me to save your marriage, Saskia. Yet the very first thing on your mind is still seeing your name on the deed. Your greed is a bottomless pit." At that exact moment, the heavy wooden door of my workshop swung open, and Dorian walked out into the morning fog, his face cold and hard. Saskia spun around in shock, the color draining completely from her face. She had never expected Dorian to be at the boatyard that early. What she also did not know was that before driving to my cottage, she had sent Dorian a threatening, desperate text message. "I'm going to see your old man and settle this once and for all. He's going to make this right." Dorian walked toward her, standing beside me, looking at her with complete, unshakable contempt. "Thank you, Saskia. Part of me worried I had made my decision too quickly while I was angry. But now, seeing you try to manipulate my father even after yesterday, I don't have a single doubt left in my soul. Get off our property, and if you ever contact my father again, I will have my attorney file a restraining order." Saskia completely fell apart, screaming in rage, throwing a handful of gravel at the gate before running to her luxury car and speeding away, her tires kicking up dirt in her bitterness. Over the following weeks, the consequences of her actions came one after another. The harbor townhouse was sold quickly, and after the expenses were deducted, the down payment was returned to me. Dorian used his own savings to cover the cancellation fees for the wedding services, refusing to let me pay a single penny. Saskia had to explain to her high society friends and co-workers why the grand wedding had been called off. The truth about her greed and her public humiliation of an old craftsman spread quickly through the tight-knit coastal town. The very same socialites who had once listened to her proudly boast about her expensive townhouse now looked at her with mocking, pitiful eyes. She lost her love, she lost her reputation, and she lost the wealthy future she believed she had secured. A few weeks later, Dorian came to me with a beautiful decision. He used the rest of his personal savings to contact the new owner of the Western Cove. With complete, humble sincerity, he asked if he could buy back just one small section of the property, the exact place where Genevieve had planted her 12 wild beach rose bushes. The new owner, touched by his story, agreed that afternoon. My son and I stood together on the Western Cove. The sweet, salty scent of the damp earth after the rain and the familiar, clean smell of pine shavings surrounded us. Dorian dug a small hole, and together we planted a young, healthy beach rose bush right beside Genevieve's original row. My son could never bring his mother back, but on that day he protected the sacred lesson she had spent her entire life teaching him. Never build your own happiness on someone else's humiliation. 3 months have passed since that day. Dorian moved back into our cozy wooden cottage by the shipyard, and the old house is filled with laughter and warmth once again. The two of us repair the antique boats together, care for our customers, and tend to the beach rose bushes on the cove. The young rose bush we planted has already begun to sprout its first green leaves. Tonight, I sat at the heavy oak table in our living room. Slowly, I opened the polished cedarwood box, the gift that had never been given during that disastrous housewarming dinner. Inside was the delicate lace tablecloth Genevieve had woven. Beneath it lay her handwritten letter, its pages slightly yellowed with time. I called Dorian over, and he sat down beside me. I read him his mother's words. My beloved son, when the day comes that you have a family of your own, I only hope you remember one thing. Real love will never make you feel ashamed of where you came from. The right person will never pull you away from your family. They will quietly help make room for one more chair at our family table. Dorian sat in silence, tears rolling down his cheeks. I did not lecture him with empty words. I simply rested my rough, calloused hand on my son's shoulder. Looking back on everything, I came away with several painful but priceless lessons about life. The first lesson: never ignore small acts of disrespect. Cruelty rarely kicks your front door down. It usually slips inside, disguised as a tasteless joke, a look of contempt, or a half-hearted apology. If someone mocks your parents, your past, or your honest work, they are showing you the cracks in their foundation. Pay attention before you build a life on top of them. The second lesson: the way your partner treats your parents reflects who they truly are when the masks are off. They do not have to love your parents the way you do, but they must respect them. Without respect, a marriage is nothing more than an expensive house built on unstable mud. A person who asks you to discard your family is a person who will eventually discard you when you no longer serve their purposes. The third lesson: protecting your family does not mean protecting wrongdoing. Dorian did not stand up for me simply because I was his father. He stood up for a fundamental human boundary that should never be crossed. No one has the right to use love as an excuse to force another person to accept humiliation. True loyalty means holding those we love to high standards of character. The fourth lesson: patience in the wrong place becomes an accomplice to wrongdoing. I once believed that staying silent and enduring her insults would preserve my son's happiness. Instead, that weak silence only taught a greedy person that she could go even further. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stand up and draw an absolute line in the sand. Do you think Dorian made the right decision by calling off the wedding that very night? Leave your thoughts and the city you love in the comments. And if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting the dignity of someone you love, remember this: real love never asks you to bow your head in humiliation. Thank you for joining us on Whispered Truths. Be sure to subscribe for more heartfelt family stories where the truth may arrive late, but the consequences always find the right person. We'll see you in the next story. Saskia once publicly said that I smelled like a rotting shipyard. She was only half right. I carried the honest scent of wood shavings, sweat, pine resin, and a lifetime of hard work. But that night, the thing that truly polluted the room was never my boots. It was her greed, her ignorance, and her hollow soul.